I have a difficult relationship with the term self-care. On the one hand, it's wonderful seeing self-care become more widely discussed and appreciated. In many cases, it's become part of our everyday conversations with each other, and there's more acceptance than ever that self-care is not only legitimate, it's essential to both personal and social well-being. On the other hand, self-care has become predictably commodified, and self-care is increasingly discussed in terms that have a price tag in terms of time, money, and resources that also predictably make it mainly available to those with the privilege of financial and social stability. Self-care is also increasingly weaponized against people, such as working class folks, who are told that they need to do a better job at self-care so that they can endure what are essentially unhealthy, unjust working conditions. But the goal of self-care is not, or at least should not, be accommodating injustice. When it comes to self-care, COVID-19 has intensified both the needs and the concerns. There's a proliferation of web pages and news programs about how self-care can help you get through the pandemic, such as these words from the Mayo Clinic. Quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic can feel overwhelming due to new information, long work hours, and caring for your family and yourself. It's important to pause for a moment and collect your thoughts, as worldwide pandemics can be taxing. Remaining calm can help. It's normal to feel stressed or overwhelmed during uncertain times. Emotions in response to uncertainty may include anxiety, fear, anger, and sadness. You could also feel helpless, discouraged, and occasionally out of control. Physical responses may include headache, muscle tension, fatigue, and sleeplessness. Taking care of yourself is important, so you're equipped to help your family and yourself through this time." The page goes on to list strategies for supporting your physical and mental health, symptoms to watch out for, and links to other pages, including one for helping children cope with the pandemic. And it appears that this is exactly what people are doing. Last May, the Harris poll surveyed over 2,000 adults who reported doing many of the types of things that show up on those self-care lists, things like doing creative activities, praying, having meaningful conversations, and using technology to stay connected in new ways, spending time outside, and eating healthy foods. But that's not all that survey revealed. It also described that despite all this self-care, people are generally struggling with the uncertainty of living through a global pandemic. 46% of respondents said they're having difficulty maintaining their whole health, that is, physical, mental, and spiritual health. I suspect none of this will come as a surprise, but 30% said they had a lack of energy. 29% said they're struggling with sleeping. Another 29% said they were exercising less. Moreover, 45% of all U.S. adults said they have failed to get preventative health care, like wellness visits, vaccinations, and screenings during the pandemic. These survey results fit with the words that we read from the Mayo Clinic, who told us that during a global pandemic, you could feel helpless, discouraged, and occasionally out of control. What they didn't mention is it's very reasonable to feel that way given the conditions that are going on in our world and society. For example, the U.S. economy contracted at a 32.9% annual rate in the second quarter this year, and the nation is still down nearly 15 million jobs since February. 40% of renters in the United States are now facing eviction, and more than 10 million Americans are expected to lose employer-sponsored health coverage between April and December of this year. We could also detail the unfolding impacts on disabled people, women and children, Black, Indigenous, people of color, gender and sexuality minorities, the elderly, and other vulnerable groups. But I think the point is clear enough. Self-care advice is great, but it's insufficient. Being able to stay present with ourselves and one another, monitoring our emotional regulation, and paying attention to what supports our well-being, those are all wonderful and important skills. The problem with the self-care movement in the midst of a pandemic is not in providing this kind of information, and I'm glad places like the Mayo Clinic are putting it out there. The problem is that all of this is largely impossible for a significant number of people. I mentioned earlier that self-care is also being weaponized against us. In particular, people experiencing unhealthy and unsustainable circumstances are often being asked to do extra work that they don't get paid for. It's at their own expense of time, money, and energy in order to accommodate those who profit from not providing more humane conditions at work or in society. In this way, the powers that be encourage self-care as a way to prop up unjust systems, allowing them to survive while avoiding accountability for exploitative practices. But the pandemic is pushing this to even more absurd extremes. Our wisdom lesson for today came from Kim Kelly, writing in April 2020 for the Washington Post, with this headline: "Essential workers don't need our praise, they need our help. Calling essential workers heroes makes it easier to pretend that they signed up to sacrifice themselves for the rest of us." Like with so many other issues, the United States' mishandling of the pandemic hasn't created a new problem in this regard, but it most certainly is amplifying this problem. Our economy has a long history of mistreating and exploiting workers, with poor working conditions and poor pay leading to misery and death. COVID-19 has made it abundantly clear that this philosophy and practice has not changed a bit. In the absence of adequate social infrastructure, we've created a situation where it is somehow considered acceptable and necessary and even prudent to demand that a significant portion of the workforce, as Kelly put it, sacrifice themselves for the rest of us. Kelly reminds us that essential workers have always been essential and that they deserve every iota of praise, especially since so many of them are normally ignored or quietly exploited. She also rightly insists that, quote, "Calling them heroes allows those of us who are unlike them, privileged enough to remain home, to imagine that these workers agreed to serve as human sacrifices, that there is an inherent nobility in the risks they're taking. It gives us a chance to ignore the rotten, hazardous conditions that have been allowed to fester thanks to capitalist cruelty and federal malfeasance, and absolves us of any complicity." But most of these workers didn't sign up to be first responders and are now overwhelmed by the magnitude of what's being asked of them. They keep telling us that they don't want compliments, they want help, but we have continued to fail them, end quote. This is a familiar refrain, and it is inexcusable that it continues to be ignored by our society. Last May, Dr. Dhruv Kular, a physician and researcher in New York City, described his own experiences in The New Yorker. Even as infection rates of COVID-19 began to slow, he noticed that essential workers were being required to, in his words, expose themselves and their families to COVID-19 every single day, and they were paying the price in higher infection rates. He wrote, "We're now debating whether it's safe to reopen the economy, but for essential workers, it never closed. Each morning during the apex of the deadliest pandemic in a century, these men and women have been venturing out into the epicenter of disease to cook and clean, deliver food and carry mail, drive buses and stock shelves, patrol the streets and tend to the ill. Many have paid with their health, some with their lives. It's becoming clear that essential workers experience a disproportionate share of death and disease owing to COVID-19. During 1 week not long ago, I cared for a police officer, a grocery store clerk, and a bus driver. During another, my clinical service of 15 patients included 3 food delivery men. The last time I can recall caring for a delivery worker was more than 2 years ago. His leg was broken after he was hit by an SUV at a busy Manhattan intersection," end quote. Dr. Kular also went on to point out the systemic racism at work because 75% of New York City's essential workers are also people of color. The narrative behind heroism and noble sacrifice allows us to avoid that reality, to hide from the rampant racism, classism, disableism, and other oppressive systems that so deeply characterize our society. Hiding behind this image of heroism, we turn away from one another, we refuse to understand what is actually happening, and we comfort ourselves that somehow this is all okay. So what does, or what can self-care mean in the context of such disparities and injustice? From time to time, I've given workshops on this topic of reclaiming self and community care. And I begin usually with questions like these to get an answer of get an idea of where people are coming from. I'll ask, what connotation does self-care have to you? What words do you associate with self-care? What are some popular strategies? Are there any patterns to these answers? And then I'll ask, why do we need self-care in the first place? The answers I get usually depend quite a bit on the people in the workshop. If it's mainly financially stable, generally healthy white folks in the room, the answers usually have to do with coping with stress, taking time to unwind and recharge, being kind to oneself. And all of that is great and important. And I only bring it up to put it in contrast with the answers that come up when the people in the room are poor, working class, disabled, chronically ill, or not white. Then the answers are usually about survival. And self-care is typically a luxury with neither time nor money to afford or energy to enjoy. Part of this is an issue of definitions. When self-care became commodified and when it was reduced to an opportunity to make profit, our popular associations of care were largely also reduced to bubble baths. And I love a bubble bath, but bubble baths and spa days and luxury resorts. Self-care became about justifiable pampering. We needed to remember that it was okay to spend some money on ourselves and indulge in some guilty pleasures, of course, in a way that also made other folks wealthier as we went. But with these connotations, it's no wonder that people from oppressed communities have been largely alienated. Self-care as consumption just creates a further gulf between those who can afford to spend time, money, and energy on products and experiences and those who cannot. The result is that self-care now has an accessibility problem, and self-care as consumption reinforces oppressive systems, especially along ability status, economic, and racial lines. The commodification and weaponization of self-care work in favor of the status quo, and the status quo is a social system that relies on and perpetuates injustice. Further, people are so busy surviving that there isn't much left over to invest in social change. It's no accident that unhealthy, unsustainable, and unjust work and life conditions serve to both perpetuate oppressive systems and cultures and leave those most impacted by those cultures and systems with the least access to time, resources, safety, and energy to devote to movement building that would make things different. But the roots of self-care and social justice movements are much more liberating. As Audre Lorde taught us, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. When we reclaim self and community care, we find that it is about surviving and resisting injustice so we can stay in the fight and bring about change. Self-care is an act of defiance against a society that says we exist only to prop up unjust systems. And this defiance dares to envision a world where everyone's well-being is important and where everyone's needs can be met. Because in a healthy, functioning society, self-care is integrated into its habits, relationships, organizations, and culture. You wouldn't need to do anything special except in cases of crisis, trauma, or disaster. Self-care would be the norm, and resources would then be abundantly available for those times when crisis did arise. So with the commodification and weaponization of self-care, we've begun to shift our language to that of community care. This is meant to bring our attention back to the ways that self and community care have been and can be again expressions of resistance and hope, of our insistence to survive, persist, and organize in the face of direct structural and cultural violence. This reclamation can in itself be a radical act. It can be about building social capital, cultivating community, redistributing resources, modeling partnership against domination, and making organizing more resilient, sustainable, and just. And that is how I'd like for more of us to begin understanding and re-envisioning community care, especially for those of us in positions of relative power and privilege. We can leverage the growing acceptance and popularity of the self-care movement, even one that is oriented around consumption, to make self-care more accessible to people who belong to marginalized and oppressed communities. And over the years, I've collected a few working principles for supporting this kind of shift. Number one, both activism and taking a break can be expressions of self and community care, especially for people from marginalized and oppressed communities. And our strategies need to make room for both of those, of engagement and withdrawal. I start here because sometimes in our enthusiasm, we create pressures and expectations on ourselves that contribute to burnout and compassion fatigue. Sometimes my activism is exactly what I need to do to help me channel my anger and feel empowered. But at other times, I need to step away and process my emotions and experience and also just get some rest. I don't step away often, but I might step away more than I do if our movements were set up in more sustainable ways, so that activism encouraged and included supporting self-care. Secondly, self-care needs to flow out of and embody our values and aspirations. Though sometimes characterized as selfish, self and community care connect us or can connect us with our deepest understandings of love and justice. Identifying those needs and aspirations can bring clarity and be empowering to us. As we continue to build and adapt our movements for social change, we need to dream and plan. What kind of world are we creating? What will our communities look and feel like? How do we want to be treated? And how will we treat others? We can design self and community care practices that move us in the direction of our dreams and begin to make those values and aspirations a reality. Number three, because an unjust society profits from our lack of self-care, because it makes us more vulnerable to exploitation, we need to integrate both accountability and support for decisions related to our well-being. Especially for any of us who belong to marginalized communities, we have typically been very well trained in neglecting our own well-being. Surviving this present moment with all its stressors is often the most pressing task and the only thing we have room and time for. Radical self-love and self-care need to be normalized, both including, one, the legitimacy and necessity of taking care of ourselves, and two, the methods for doing so. And if you happen to have extra resources, you can contribute to this change in social norms by directly supporting marginalized communities. 4, self-care strategies should be flexible and will change over time as our circumstances and needs change. This means that reflective practices are often essential for this work. I hope this is an obvious one, that self-care during a pandemic will look differently than self-care when there isn't a pandemic. Care will also look different to different people and at different times. But I've witnessed self-care shaming at times, and that just ultimately hurts us all. Additionally, we need to remember that self-care practices are often culturally defined, so that we could treat those kinds of conversations and one another with respect as a cross-cultural conversation. As we go along, we can learn how to best support one another, how to better identify our needs, so that we can each choose the self-care practices that are most likely to meet our needs in healing and empowering ways. 5, we don't have to judge ourselves for using coping mechanisms that we understand are not sustainable for the long term. However, we can become intentional about replacing strategies that are helpful in the short term but maladaptive over time. This is another area where there's often a lot of self-care shaming, but that ultimately undermines the whole point of self-care. I can share a more lighthearted example from my own life on this point. I don't like eating donuts. I don't generally like their taste or texture, and they're too sweet for my palate. But guess what? I often crave donuts when I'm feeling exhausted and stressed out. And when I say that I crave donuts when I feel exhausted and stressed out, I don't mean I just want one donut. I want a dozen, right? I want the whole box. And I want to eat enough in one sitting that I won't feel good afterwards. I mean, I don't do it for that reason, but I want the whole box. I don't indulge in that way very often, but I've already done it twice in 2020. I don't feel guilty about that desire, and I don't feel guilty if I indulge in it. I know it's not something I want to make a habit, but sometimes it helps make the world feel like an okay place to live for at least 20 minutes or so. And sometimes that is enough to make a difference. Ideally, I know, I'll manage my stress successfully so that I won't rely on a donut binge to cope. But I'm not making any guarantees that I won't eat another dozen before 2020 comes to an end. Obviously, there's a balance here. We don't want to make decisions that harm ourselves or others, but even when we feel the urge to do something that is ultimately unhealthy, we can be compassionate with ourselves. We can seek to understand the underlying need that's there, and we can make the best choice that we're capable of making and resolve to keep making good choices the best that we can, getting closer and closer to well-being. Finally, number 6, expanding our attention to include self and community care bridges that gap between self and community. We are building communities and movements that embody and cultivate the type of society where self and community care can be available for everyone. Oppressive structures and cultures are the biggest barriers to self-care, and we wouldn't need a self-care movement if we lived in a wise, compassionate, just society. The longer we're delayed in accomplishing this work, the more people will suffer. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the gaps in our support for self and community care. And that calls for creativity, persistence, and solidarity. We have to look for ways we can fill in the gaps so that those who are being pushed to absurd extremes don't get pushed all the way to the edges. We can bring them back. When we advocate for hazard pay, we're supporting community care. When we demand extension of unemployment benefits, we are advocating for community care. When we insist on disability justice and accessibility during a pandemic, we are advocating for community care. And when we work together, when we give each other rest when we need it, when we share the resources we have so that the work can continue, that is community care. Social justice is deeply related to community and self-care. This is how we can connect self and community care with the social change practices of mutual aid and dual power, but that's a reflection for another day. In the meantime, we can begin by deepening our understanding of the relationship between creating communities and societies that promote and support self-care and creating communities and societies that live up to our values of equity and justice. We can commit ourselves to building that society, one that refuses to tolerate the exploitation of the earth or our fellow human beings, so that we can finally and fully know the joy of caring for one another. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.